It was a humid Tuesday afternoon in July 1978 when Jimmy Cliff walked into Martinez Music Store on Bleecker Street in New York City, looking for a simple acoustic guitar to replace one that had been damaged during his recent tour. He was dressed casually in worn jeans and a plain white t-shirt, with his signature dreadlocks tucked under a simple knit cap, appearing like any other musician browsing for equipment in one of Greenwich Village's many music shops that serve the neighborhood's vibrant community of artists. The store was small and cramped, filled with guitars hanging from every available wall space, amplifiers stacked in corners, and the musty smell of old wood and leather that characterized authentic music shops that had been serving musicians for decades. Behind the counter sat Carlos Martinez, a stocky man in his 50s with graying hair and thick glasses, who had inherited the shop from his father and took enormous pride in his knowledge of musical instruments and their construction. Carlos had been running Martinez Music Store for over 20 years, and he prided himself on being an expert who could match any musician with the perfect instrument for their needs. He had developed a reputation in the village for his extensive knowledge of guitar construction, wood types, and tonal qualities, though he was also known for being somewhat condescending to customers he deemed less knowledgeable about musical instruments and their sophisticated technical specifications. When Jimmy entered the store and began quietly examining the acoustic guitars displayed along the back wall, Carlos immediately approached him with the confident demeanor of someone who believed he could educate any customer about the superiority of his merchandise and his own expertise in musical instrument selection and evaluation that had been refined through decades of experience. "Can I help you find something specific?" Carlos asked, sizing up Jimmy as just another amateur musician who probably couldn't appreciate the finer qualities of professional-grade instruments. "We've got some excellent guitars here, but you need to understand what makes a quality instrument if you want to make the right investment for your musical development." Jimmy nodded politely and pointed to a Martin D28 that had caught his eye, explaining that he was looking for something with good projection and warm tone for acoustic performances. But Carlos immediately launched into what would become an exhausting 20-minute monologue about guitar construction, wood aging, and tonal characteristics that went far beyond what Jimmy had requested or needed to hear. "Now this instrument here," Carlos began, lifting the Martin from its display hook with reverent care, "is constructed with East Indian rosewood back and sides, which provides superior bass response compared to cheaper alternatives like laminated woods. The Sitka spruce top has been aged for minimum 5 years before construction, and you can hear the difference in the harmonic complexity when you understand what to listen for and have developed proper musical ears." Carlos proceeded to explain every aspect of the guitar's construction in excruciating detail, from the ebony fretboard and bone nut to the herringbone purfling and scalloped bracing pattern, speaking with the authority of someone who assumed his customer had never encountered such sophisticated musical craftsmanship before and needed extensive education about quality instruments and their technical superiority. Jimmy listened patiently for several minutes, occasionally nodding and asking brief questions, but Carlos interpreted Jimmy's quiet demeanor as evidence that he was dealing with someone who lacked sophisticated understanding of musical instruments and needed comprehensive instruction about what made this particular guitar worthy of serious consideration by professional musicians with discriminating tastes. "The thing most people don't realize," Carlos continued, warming to his subject as he demonstrated various playing techniques on the instrument with exaggerated precision, "is that wood density affects sustained duration, and the specific grain pattern of this particular piece of rosewood creates overtones that amateur players can't even detect without proper training and experience with high-quality instruments." As Carlos's lecture continued relentlessly, covering topics from bridge construction to nut width specifications, Jimmy began to feel increasingly uncomfortable with the condescending tone and the assumption that he needed such basic instruction about guitar construction and acoustic properties that he had been studying and working with professionally for over 15 years of his musical career. You see, when you're strumming, Carlos demonstrated with exaggerated precision, holding the guitar like a precious artifact. The way the strings vibrate against the saddle creates harmonics that resonate through the body cavity. But only if you understand proper technique and can appreciate the subtleties that separate professional instruments from amateur equipment that most people unfortunately settle for. Jimmy tried several times to politely indicate that he understood guitar construction and simply wanted to test the instrument's sound and feel. But Carlos interpreted these interruptions as proof that his customer was impatient and probably couldn't afford such a high-quality instrument anyway, which only encouraged him to emphasize the guitar's superior qualities more aggressively and convincingly. Now, the inlay work here is genuine abalone, not the synthetic materials they use on cheaper guitars that look similar but lack the authentic craftsmanship, Carlos explained, pointing to the decorative elements around the sound hole with the reverence of someone displaying religious artifacts. Most people can't tell the difference, but when you develop a trained eye, you learn to recognize authentic craftsmanship and understand why certain instruments command premium prices. After 20 minutes of this relentless lecture about guitar construction, wood types, pickup systems, and proper playing technique, Carlos finally handed the instrument to Jimmy with a patronizing smile and said, "Go ahead and try it. But remember what I've told you about proper hand position and strumming technique if you want to hear what this instrument is really capable of producing when played by someone who understands its superior qualities." Jimmy took the guitar and played a few simple chords, testing the action and intonation while listening to the instrument's natural resonance and tonal balance with the practiced ear of someone who had been evaluating guitars professionally for decades. The guitar was well constructed and had decent sound quality, but it lacked the warmth and projection he was looking for in an acoustic instrument, and the neck felt slightly too wide for his playing style and hand size. After a few minutes of playing, during which he demonstrated considerably more skill and musical sophistication than Carlos's lecture had suggested he possessed, Jimmy handed the guitar back to Carlos and said simply, "It's a nice instrument, but it's not quite what I'm looking for. The tone is a bit bright for my style, and I prefer a narrower neck width for the kind of playing I do." Carlos's expression immediately changed from patronizing patience to obvious irritation and wounded pride. He had just spent 20 minutes explaining why this particular guitar represented the pinnacle of acoustic instrument craftsmanship, and this customer was dismissing his expertise and rejecting his recommendation without proper appreciation for the extensive knowledge he had shared about superior musical equipment. "What do you mean it's not what you're looking for?" Carlos asked, his voice rising with indignation and professional offense. "I just spent 20 minutes explaining exactly why this is one of the finest guitars we carry. The tone characteristics I described are exactly what professional musicians prefer, and the next specifications are industry standard for serious players who understand quality instruments." Jimmy tried to explain calmly that he simply preferred different tonal qualities and physical specifications for his particular style of music. But Carlos became increasingly agitated, interpreting Jimmy's polite disagreement as a personal attack on his expertise and professional credibility that he had been building throughout his decades in the music business, serving demanding musicians. "Look," Carlos said, his patience clearly exhausted and his voice becoming sharper. "I've been selling guitars for over 20 years, and I know what makes a quality instrument. Just because you can't hear the difference doesn't mean this guitar isn't superior to anything else in your price range. Maybe you should consider something more basic until your ear develops." Jimmy remained calm and diplomatic, explaining that different guitarists preferred different sound qualities and that personal preference played a large role in instrument selection. But Carlos was now too invested in proving his point and defending his professional reputation to listen to reasonable explanations about individual musical tastes and playing styles that might differ from his recommendations. "I think you don't understand what you're hearing," Carlos continued, his voice becoming louder and more confrontational as his frustration mounted. "This guitar has been praised by professional musicians and music reviewers, and if you can't appreciate its qualities, maybe you need to develop your ear and gain more experience before investing in professional equipment." At this point, Jimmy tried to politely excuse himself and look at other guitars in the store. But Carlos had become so frustrated with having his expertise questioned that he couldn't let the matter drop without making his point about the customer's obvious lack of musical sophistication and understanding of quality craftsmanship. "You know what?" Carlos finally exploded, his voice echoing through the small shop and carrying clearly onto Bleecker Street. "You don't understand anything about guitars. I just wasted 20 minutes explaining instrument construction to someone who obviously can't appreciate quality craftsmanship when he hears it." The shouting was loud enough to be heard clearly on Bleecker Street through the shop's open door, and several people walking by stopped to see what was causing such a commotion in the usually quiet music store that served the neighborhood's community of professional and amateur musicians with generally respectful and knowledgeable service. "You're just another amateur who thinks he knows about music," Carlos continued yelling, his face red with anger and embarrassment at having his expertise so thoroughly dismissed by someone he had assumed was an ignorant customer. "I've been in this business longer than you've probably been playing, and I know what I'm talking about." The noise attracted the attention of three people who had been browsing in the record store next door. Marcus Williams, a session drummer who had worked with several famous artists; Sarah Chen, a music journalist for Rolling Stone magazine; and Robert Thompson, a guitar technician who worked for major recording studios in Manhattan and was familiar with many professional musicians. They entered Martinez Music Store, expecting to see some kind of customer service dispute. But when they saw Jimmy Cliff standing calmly near the counter, while Carlos continued his tirade about musical ignorance and amateur players, their expressions immediately changed from curiosity to shock and embarrassment at witnessing such disrespectful treatment of someone they recognized immediately. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered to Marcus, recognizing Jimmy immediately, despite his casual appearance and attempt to remain inconspicuous. "That's Jimmy Cliff. That man is yelling at one of the most important reggae artists in music history. He doesn't have any idea who he's talking to." Marcus nodded in amazement, realizing that they were witnessing a music store owner berating someone who had written and performed some of the most influential consciousness-raising songs ever recorded, including hits that had introduced reggae music to international audiences and influenced countless other musicians throughout the world. Robert, who had worked as a guitar technician for many famous musicians throughout his career, immediately recognized Jimmy's distinctive features and calm demeanor despite the hostile situation, understanding that they were watching a legendary consciousness-raising artist being treated with incredible disrespect by someone who had absolutely no idea about his customer's international reputation and musical achievements. The three newcomers stood in stunned silence as Carlos continued his angry lecture about musical knowledge and professional standards, completely oblivious to the fact that he was insulting someone whose musical contributions had shaped popular culture and influenced generations of consciousness-raising artists worldwide through decades of dedicated spiritual service. "Sir," Sarah finally interrupted, her voice cutting through Carlos's tirade with professional authority, "do you realize who you're talking to?" Carlos turned toward the newcomers with irritation, assuming they were going to side with his difficult customer and further undermine his professional authority in his own establishment. "I don't care who he thinks he is," Carlos snapped aggressively. "I know guitars, and I was trying to educate someone who obviously doesn't appreciate quality instruments or understand superior craftsmanship." Marcus stepped forward and said quietly but firmly, "Carlos, this is Jimmy Cliff. He's one of the most respected musicians in the world. He starred in The Harder They Come and wrote songs like Many Rivers to Cross and The Harder They Come. He's been playing guitar professionally for decades and has influenced countless artists. The effect of this revelation on Carlos was immediate and dramatically transformative. His angry expression froze completely, his face went pale, and he looked back and forth between Jimmy and the people who had just identified him, realizing with growing horror that he had just spent 20 minutes condescendingly lecturing one of the most influential musicians of the 20th century about basic guitar construction. You're Jimmy Cliff?" Carlos whispered, his voice barely audible as the full magnitude of his catastrophic mistake began sinking in. "The reggae singer? From the movie? The consciousness-raising artist?" Jimmy nodded with his characteristic gentle smile and extended his hand toward Carlos, who was now visibly shaking as he realized he had been treating a legendary consciousness-raising artist like an ignorant amateur who needed basic instruction about musical instruments and professional standards that Jimmy had been working with for decades. "That's right," Jimmy said calmly, showing no anger or resentment, despite the disrespectful treatment he had just endured with remarkable patience. "I was just looking for a guitar with particular tonal qualities for some acoustic work I'm doing. Different musicians prefer different sounds, you know? Personal preference is important in music." Carlos stared at Jimmy in complete mortification, understanding that he had not only been rude to a customer, but had insulted someone whose musical knowledge and experience far exceeded his own, and whose contributions to popular music had earned him international recognition and respect from musicians worldwide who considered him a consciousness-raising pioneer. "Mr. Cliff, I'm so incredibly sorry," Carlos stammered, his earlier confidence completely evaporated and replaced by genuine remorse. "I had no idea. I didn't recognize. Please forgive me. I was completely out of line. I should never have spoken to you that way, or any customer that way. This is mortifying." The transformation in Carlos's demeanor was complete and immediate. The condescending expert had become a star-struck fan, desperately trying to make amends for his embarrassing behavior, while the three witnesses watched this dramatic reversal with a mixture of satisfaction and second-hand embarrassment at the spectacular nature of Carlos's mistake. "It's all right," Jimmy said graciously, demonstrating the consciousness-raising principles of forgiveness and understanding that characterized his spiritual approach to human relationships, even in difficult situations. "We all have our passionate moments. You clearly care about your instruments and want to share your knowledge. That's admirable, even if the delivery could be improved." Carlos was now practically trembling as he realized the full scope of his mistake, not just in terms of customer service, but in terms of having insulted someone whose musical achievements and cultural contributions he had actually admired for years, without making the connection between the legendary artist and the casually dressed customer. "Mr. Cliff, please, let me show you our entire collection," Carlos said desperately, his voice filled with genuine respect and professional humility. "We have some wonderful instruments that might be more suited to your style. I have a 1960s Guild that might have the warmer tone you're looking for, and several classical guitars with narrower necks that might feel more comfortable." For the next hour, Carlos became the most attentive and respectful music store employee imaginable, bringing out his finest instruments and asking detailed questions about Jimmy's musical preferences and playing style, treating him with the reverence typically reserved for visiting royalty or religious leaders, while demonstrating genuine interest in serving his needs. Jimmy graciously allowed Carlos to redeem himself, testing several guitars and providing thoughtful feedback about their tonal qualities and construction, demonstrating the extensive knowledge and refined musical ear that Carlos had questioned so aggressively just an hour earlier, while showing patience and forgiveness that impressed everyone present. Marcus, Sarah, and Robert remained in the store, fascinated by the complete reversal in dynamics. and Carlos's desperate attempts to transform himself from condescending expert to humble servant of a consciousness-raising musical legend, whose very presence had revolutionized the atmosphere of the small Greenwich Village shop. Jimmy eventually found a 1965 Guild that had the worn, woody tone and comfortable neck specifications he preferred, and Carlos insisted on giving him a substantial discount while apologizing repeatedly for his earlier behavior and thanking him for his patience and understanding despite the completely inappropriate and disrespectful treatment he had initially received. The story of Carlos's transformation spread quickly through the Greenwich Village music community, becoming a cautionary tale about assumptions and respect that reminded everyone in the business that you never know who might walk through your door seeking musical equipment or services, and that treating every customer with dignity was both morally right and professionally wise. Carlos kept a photograph of himself with Jimmy Cliff prominently displayed behind the counter for the rest of his career, and he never again made assumptions about a customer's musical knowledge or treated anyone with the kind of condescending attitude that had nearly cost him the opportunity to meet one of his musical heroes and consciousness-raising inspirations. The incident taught Carlos valuable lessons about humility, respect, and the danger of assumptions that transformed not only his approach to customer service, but his entire understanding of how consciousness-raising principles should guide human interactions, especially in situations where knowledge and expertise might create opportunities for either service or superiority. Years later, Carlos would tell the story to new employees and fellow music store owners, emphasizing how close he had come to permanently damaging his reputation and missing the chance to serve a musical legend simply because he had made assumptions about someone's appearance rather than treating them with proper respect. The guitar shop incident became part of Jimmy Cliff's own repertoire of stories about human nature and consciousness-raising opportunities, demonstrating how moments of conflict could become teaching experiences when approached with patience, forgiveness, and understanding, rather than anger or resentment that might escalate situations unnecessarily. Jimmy often reflected on how Carlos's initial condescension had transformed into genuine respect once the truth was revealed, understanding that most people were capable of growth when confronted with their mistakes in ways that allowed them to maintain dignity while learning important lessons about treating others respectfully. The incident also reinforced Jimmy's belief in consciousness-raising approaches to conflict resolution, showing how remaining calm in difficult situations could create opportunities for positive transformation that benefited everyone involved, rather than simply winning arguments or proving points about professional disagreements. Music industry professionals who heard the story began using it as an example of why assumptions about customers could lead to embarrassing mistakes and missed opportunities for meaningful connections with people who might have valuable contributions, despite their unassuming appearance during initial encounters. If this incredible story of how a music store owner's condescending lecture to Jimmy Cliff backfired spectacularly when other customers recognized the reggae legend and completely transformed the shop owner's attitude from arrogant expert to humble fan moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more amazing tales of consciousness-raising artists whose quiet dignity in difficult situations teaches important lessons about respect, humility, and human understanding.